Thank you for joining today's webinar on Michigan K-12 Virtual Learning Effectiveness Report for the 2016-17 school year. My name is Melissa. We are experimenting with using YouTube to host our webinars. Please use the chat feature to raise questions or leave a comment. I will be monitoring the chat for our presenter and will alert him to your questions. Before we get started, here is our standard disclaimer. This webinar will be recorded and shared publicly. Consequently, anything shared during this webinar, including chat comments, could be shared publicly. This webinar may represent a presenter's or an attendee's personal views, opinions, conclusions, and other information which do not necessarily reflect those of Michigan Virtual and/or the Michigan Virtual Learning Research Institute, and are not given nor endorsed by Michigan Virtual or MVLRI unless otherwise specified. Now I would like to introduce you to our webinar presenter, Dr. Joe Freidhoff. Dr. Joe Freidhoff is Vice President at Michigan Virtual and also leads the Michigan Virtual Learning Research Institute. Dr. Freidhoff is a nationally recognized researcher who specializes in K-12 online learning policy, evaluation of statewide K-12 online programs, management of Michigan virtual schools, and quality assurance. Dr. Freidhoff earned his PhD in Educational Technologies from Michigan State University. He also has experience teaching in face-to-face and online settings. And with that, Dr. Freidhoff.
Thank you, Melissa. The purpose of our webinar today is to highlight some of the key findings from our recently released Michigan's K-12 Virtual Learning Effectiveness Report. I believe links to our effectiveness report resources are included in the YouTube description, so please feel free to check those out as we go along. The goal for the time that we have together today is to communicate some of the key trends and statistics observed when looking at the statewide virtual learning data for the 2016-17 school year. These findings may help practitioners ask new and important questions when evaluating their virtual learning programs. For researchers, some of the findings may spark areas of new inquiry. Before we get into specifics about this year's report, I think it's important to understand a couple of policies that have helped shape Michigan's K-12 virtual learning environment. The first is the state's online learning requirement. Introduced in 2006 as part of the Michigan Merit Curriculum, the online learning requirement requires Michigan students to have an online learning experience in order to graduate from high school. This experience was seen as a strategy to better prepare students for an increasingly technological and global society. Michigan was the first state in the country with such a requirement, though since then, several other states have enacted similar requirements. The second key driver came into existence in 2013. That year, the Michigan legislature added language to the State School Aid Act to provide students with consent of the parent or guardian the right to take up to 2 online courses per academic term. With the exception of a few reasons, schools cannot deny those enrollment requests. Michigan is one of several states with a policy providing parents with course choice. Fortunately, with these policies, we also have reporting on virtual learning. Schools are required to report data on their virtual learners to the state as part of the Michigan Student Data Systems Collection. This means that schools report all of their virtual and non-virtual enrollments for each student who took at least one virtual course. As part of the MSDS teacher-student data link collection, schools are required to report that course information on students that fall within 4 of those special population groups. One of those population groups is virtual participants, and they used a field called the virtual method that ties together. This virtual method field has 4 values that a school can choose from. Those 4 include blended learning, digital learning, not virtual, or online course. 98% of the virtual enrollments identified in this report were due to the virtual method flag being set to one of the 3 virtual options. The remaining 2% of the enrollments came from searches of enrollments in the TSDL that we believe had a virtual method flag that was not virtual, but the course title maybe suggested that the virtual method was incorrect. So examples of local course title searches that we would flag might be, the local course title says Michigan Virtual School, and of course we don't have anything that's non-virtual, but the flag was not set. This was true of other common third-party indicators, as well as general references to online or virtual providers that we knew of. To point out the obvious, there are likely enrollments included in the report that are counted as being delivered virtually that were not, either because the local course title search process I described earlier mistakenly added courses, or because the school made a mistake in the coding and we didn't have a way of identifying ones that should have been. Consequently, the figures in this report should be treated as estimates that, generally speaking, convey the trends observed for the 2016-17 school year. At the risk of stating the obvious, let's clarify a couple of terms before we get started. First, when I talk about students or virtual learners, we're really talking about people, and most likely counts of people. When I use the term enrollments, we're really talking about courses, semester length or trimester taken by students. And throughout, I'm probably going to switch between using the terms online or virtual. I use them interchangeably and don't make a distinction between the two of them in this presentation. In the report, you find that we broke virtual learners into 3 types. The first type is what we call part-time Michigan virtual. This included virtual enrollments from students who were identified as taking at least one online course with Michigan Virtual. For those of you who don't know, Michigan Virtual is a state-supported supplementary virtual school program that was created by Public Act 230 of 2000. And if a student was flagged as having at least one enrollment with Michigan Virtual, all of their virtually delivered enrollments for that student were flagged as being provided for Michigan Virtual. We didn't have a way of teasing out which ones weren't. So it's worth noting that while not all of them may have been from them, there was just no clear way to separate. So therefore, this report is attributing all virtual enrollments from these students to Michigan Virtual. We had a second type of part-time learner that taking courses a la carte, and we called this the part-time for anyone who was not from Michigan Virtual. These courses were pretty prevalent, as you'll come to see, and were similar to Michigan Virtual in the sense that these were not full-time, which leads us into our last category, full-time online learners. These were kids who took all of their coursework online, either through an LEA building that was a full-time program, or through a cyber charter school in our state. Cyber schools in Michigan provide full-time instruction through online learning. Cyber schools were first created through Public Act 205 of 2009, so we've had them for quite some time, and any of them that fall into there. But we're seeing some more increases in local schools, non-charter schools that are providing it, so we've kind of made this more generic to full-time in this year's report. All right. Let's talk a little bit about how we looked at student performance. In the data collection, the schools had 11 different statuses to choose from when declaring a final completion status for an enrollment. Only one of those, completed passed, represented that the student both finished the course and met the minimum expectations for passing the course. Other examples of the 10 that you see in that list: audited, testing out, completed and failed, withdrawn, and even withdrawn passing. This report continues to use the same formula for calculating the virtual pass rate as the previous reports. To calculate the virtual pass rate, we counted the number of enrollments with a completion status of completed passed. We divided that number by the total number of virtual enrollments. As is likely evident, if some of these statuses were excluded from the calculation, say for instance, audited enrollments or withdrawn passing, the virtual pass rate would change. Given the data this year and in the past years, the impact of such exclusions would be fairly minimal, likely only a few percentage points. All right, with that background, let's talk a little bit more about the data. In the 2016-17 school year, we found over 101,000 Michigan K-12 public school students reported having taken at least one online course. This represented about 7% of the total Michigan K-12 public school student population. Those students produced over 500,000 virtual enrollments. Close to 70% of those enrollments were in the core subject areas. Once again, English language and literature was the subject area with the highest virtual enrollments. They approached close to 100,000 virtual enrollments, or 19% of the enrollments. English 9, 10, 11, 12, those were the most highly enrolled in titles. and the overall pass rate for ELA was 52%. Mathematics had almost 90,000 virtual enrollments, or about 17% of them. Again, the enrollments tended to be in the the graduation requirements. We see geometry, Algebra 2, Algebra 1 as being the high enrollment courses in there. The overall pass rate in mathematics was 49%. Life and physical science had over almost 75,000 virtual enrollments, or 14% of them. Bio, chemistry, earth science, these were the course titles that were responsible for more than 10% of the life and physical science courses. The overall pass rate in life and physical sciences was 53%. Finally, social sciences and history had over 86,000 virtual enrollments, or 17%. The titles of US history, economics, world history, all yielded enrollment totals of more than 10% of the virtual enrollments. The pass rate for social sciences was 56%. For each of the core subjects shown on this slide, and for many other subject areas as well, the virtual pass rates were consistently lower than the non-virtual pass rates for the virtual learner in their non-virtual courses. This is a trend that has been consistent with past years. If we look at school level, students in grades K in 9 through 12 accumulated 79% of all virtual enrollments. And this has been consistent with past years. I think the juniors and seniors just themselves accounted for close to 50 or 55% of the enrollments. Almost 600 Michigan school districts reported at least one virtual enrollment. And this represents approximately 2/3 of Michigan public schools districts were having at least one virtual learner. In terms of the number of schools, over 1,100 schools reported having at least one virtual enrollment. 56% of which reported 100 or more virtual enrollments. It may be worth mentioning that 16% of the schools reported having less than 10. Thus, only about a quarter of schools fell somewhere in between that 100 or more or less than 10. While one would expect the higher enrollment schools to have a larger impact on the data, we think it's important to keep in mind that 97% of the state's virtual enrollments came from the 613 schools with 100 or more virtual enrollments. So this data is going to kind of present a good picture of those kinds of schools. Collectively, the state's overall virtual pass rate for the 2016-17 school year was 55%. This was a decrease of 3% from the prior year. There exists important variation to consider when we interpret this statistic. For instance, the pass rate varied by school emphasis. Schools whose emphasis was alternative education had a pass rate of just 44%. 25% of schools were considered alternative education schools, and they generated almost 40% of the virtual enrollments. General education schools, on the other hand, had a 62% pass rate. They represented 73% of the schools, but only 61% of the virtual enrollments. Close to 300 Michigan public schools had school-wide virtual pass rates of 90 to 100%. 55% of schools had a pass rate of 70% or greater. So clearly, there are virtual models at play in Michigan schools that are working, but not enough with a statewide pass rate of 55%. Roughly 6 out of 10 virtual enrollments came in part-time or a la carte fashion, where students were taking less than a full schedule virtually. Of that set, 57% used a provider other than Michigan Virtual. There were clear performance differences across these three types. Michigan virtual enrollments had the highest pass rate at 81%. It's important to understand these pass rates in light of the non-virtual performance for these students. For instance, Michigan virtual students had a 92% pass rate in their non-virtual courses, in their face-to-face courses, which is 11% higher than their virtual pass rate. The non-virtual pass rate was much higher than the non-virtual pass rate for part-time non-Michigan virtual type, which had a 75% pass rate in their face-to-face courses 18% higher than their virtual pass rate. 54% of virtual learners in the data for the 16-17 school year were classified as living in poverty based on their eligibility for free and reduced lunches. This is about 8% higher than the K-12 statewide average for students, which was about 46% in the fall of 2016. Students living in poverty took 62% of the virtual enrollments for the year. Thus, they accounted for a disproportionate amount of the virtual enrollments. When it came to performance, students who were not in poverty had a 66% pass rate in their virtual courses. Unfortunately, those in poverty passed their virtual courses less than half the time. Generally speaking, students taking fewer virtual courses experienced greater success. Those students who took only 1 or 2 virtual courses during the year had a 73% pass rate. Students who took 5 or more virtual courses had a pass rate that was only 51%. 48% of virtual learners passed every virtual enrollment they took. 1/4 of virtual learners did not pass any of their virtual enrollments. That leaves a little over 1/4 who passed some, but not all of their virtual courses. For the more than 2,500 students who, 25,000 students who did not pass any of their virtual courses, 46% only took 1 or 2 courses, so that seems reasonable. On the other hand, we had almost 9,500 students who took and did not pass 5 or more virtual courses. And we had 2,771 students who did not pass 11 or more virtual courses. Further analysis of students failing all of their 11 or more virtual courses showed that 60% of the learners came from the full-time, including cybers. 72%, or about 1,200 of those full-time students were from PSA cyber schools. 34% of the 2,771 students, represented by the orange arc, came from part-time non-Michigan virtual, and the remaining percentage came from students who had enrollments reported by both full-time and part-time non-Michigan virtual types. The part-time Michigan virtual type had less than 10 students, 0% basically, failing all of their 11 or more virtual courses. From a school emphasis perspective, 51% of the students that failed everything came from the general education settings, and 42% were enrolled through alternative education settings. None of the other settings or combinations of the various settings accounted for more than 3%. Finally, 77% of the 2,771 students were in poverty. Despite those downing statistics, the report also showed students and programs are having success with virtual learning. Close to half of the students who took at least 1 virtual course passed every one of their virtual courses. That was close to 160,000 enrollments from students who were always successful with virtual learning. Over 1/4 of Michigan schools had online pass rates of 90% or higher, and over half of Michigan schools achieved a school-wide pass rate of greater than or equal to 70%. Also, over half the schools with online learning had over 100 online enrollments, so we are seeing school models that support large numbers of students simultaneously experience high levels of student success with virtual learning. Michigan's K-12 students access 29 different AP courses, providing students with options not available in most schools across the state. But to help our state increase its overall performance with online learning, it's going to take learning these successes of the students and programs in these schools and spreading them to those that are underperforming. As we've seen providers like Michigan Virtual, providers, we have large numbers of virtual learning while maintaining pass rates of greater than 80%. So far, the measures of student success has been whether or not a student has passed their virtual course or courses. But the report also has some data on how well virtual learners perform on state standardized assessments. As would be expected, the percentage of virtual learners testing proficient on these state tests varied considerably when we took into account their non-virtual performance. For instance, students taking a minimum of 3 non-virtual courses and passing all of them had proficiency rates that exceeded the statewide average for each of the 4 tests. Students who did not pass 1 or 2 of their non-virtual courses, and those not passing 3 or more of their 3 or more non-virtual courses had much lower rates of proficiency. Students in poverty consistently recorded proficiency rates that were 20 to 30% lower than their peers who were not in poverty. A similar gap, though not as big, was found with students based on their seat time waiver status. Students with a seat time waiver, which in Michigan is a waiver that adjusts the requirement for the student to be physically in attendance at the school facility and lifts the cap on the number of virtual courses that a student can take away from school, made up 18% of the virtual learners. 29% of the virtual enrollments were from students on a seat time waiver. The actual virtual pass rate for students with a seat time waiver, 48%, was 10% lower than those without one. Students with a seat time waiver were 14 to 19% less likely to reach proficiency on the state tests than those without a waiver. Students taking virtual courses with Michigan Virtual had the highest rates of proficiency on the 4 tests, exceeding the state average on all 4 examinations. Students from the part-time non-Michigan Virtual type had rates that were higher than those from the full-time, including Cyber's type. By the way, this table is an example of the rich information that is contained in the report's appendices. When considering the non-virtual performance of students, Michigan Virtual students consistently outperform the non-Michigan Virtual part-time solutions by double digits. The report also includes a couple maps of Michigan. The map on this slide shows the percentage of students in each ISD area that took at least 1 virtual course in the 2016-17 school year from a non-cyber provider. The darker the blue, the higher the percentage of students who took a virtual course other than from the cyber school. Berry, Berrien, Charlevoix-Emmett, Coeur, Gogebic-Ontonagon, Huron, Iosco, Jackson, St. Joseph, Sanilac, Tuscola, and West Shore ISDs had more than 10% of their students take a virtual course in 2016-17. Since cyber schools do not really have their own resident district, but rather draw students from other districts to attend their schools, this map shows where the cyber school students were actually located. The darker the orange, the higher the percentage of cyber school students. Students who are residents of Wayne, Oakland, Macomb, Genesee, and Kent ISDs made up the highest percentage of cyber school students in the state for the 2016-17 school year. This year's report represents the 7th year of data on the effectiveness of virtual learning in Michigan. Over the 7 years of data, we've seen the number of virtual learners grow from over 36,000 to over 100,000. We've seen the number of virtual enrollments grow from just shy of 90,000 to over 500,000 enrollments. The number of schools with virtual learning grew from around 650 to now over 1,100 schools. The declining trend for virtual pass rate has continued. The data clearly indicate that schools can and do succeed with virtual learning. Close to half of virtual learners passed all of their virtual courses, and over a quarter of schools with virtual learning had school-wide pass rates of 90 to 100%. Yet many kids, too many kids, had little to no success with virtual learning. The data in this report represent an opportunity for schools and educational stakeholders to have critical conversations about what is working and for whom it's working, and what's not working, and under what circumstances those results are occurring. Michigan Virtual has created many resources that can assist schools in reflecting upon and improving their virtual programs. Some of these resources include our student guide to online learning. This guide is aimed at middle and high school students who are thinking about taking a virtual course. The guide shares advice and recommendations from virtual instructors, mentors, and virtual students. We have a parent guide to online learning. This guide is written for parents and guardians of students thinking about taking a virtual course, but it's also relevant for other adults such as school counselors. The guide contains helpful information to assist with the decision-making process. Our teacher guide to online learning. This guide is intended to support those new to teaching online. Mentor fundamentals. All Michigan public school students taking virtual courses are expected to have a mentor assigned to them. The mentor is an employee of the school district that the student attends and acts as a critical on-site support for the student. This guide helps mentors better understand the role of mentoring and includes recommended practices for supporting students. And finally, we have a school board guide to online learning. This guide has been prepared with review and support from the Michigan Association of School Boards to acquaint school board members with K-12 online learning. The guide includes general information about K-12 online learning, successful attributes of online learners and online programs, and Michigan-specific requirements that all districts need to abide by. It also references many practical resources for more in-depth study. And this summer, we'll be releasing an administrator guide to online learning to continue to build upon this great set of resources. All of these guides and other practical resources are available on the Michigan Virtual and Michigan Virtual Learning Research Institute websites. I hope you take time to check them out. Thank you for taking time today to learn more about virtual learning in Michigan. There are many more details in the report itself, so please take some time to look through that report, including the main data tables at the end of the report. It's very rich in content and would love to hear your feedback and questions on that. At this time, I'm going to just check in to see if we have any comments or questions. It's coming up from our chat audience. Well, seeing none, I'm going to talk about our next webinar. We have a webinar coming up at 1 p.m. on Wednesday, June 5th. We hope that you'll be able to join us when we're discussing the Iste standards refresh. So again, that's Wednesday, June 5th at 1 p.m. Hope you're able to come and share in that presentation. On behalf of our Michigan Virtual Learning Research Institute here at Michigan Virtual, I'd like to thank you for taking time today out of your schedules to learn more about the work that we're doing and the benchmarking information that we're providing in Michigan's K-12 Virtual Learning Effectiveness Report. We hope you found this webinar very fruitful, and please provide us with feedback about any information or any questions that you might have that we can help you out with. This is Joe Freidhoff saying thanks again. Take care.